Go.
Hello, Raleigh Road Baptist Church. Good to be with you again on this Wednesday evening. If you remember, 2 weeks ago, we started a new Bible study on the 12 apostles and what happened to them in their ministry after Jesus ascended into heaven. The first apostle we did was Matthew, the tax collector, and we finished his story up last week. So tonight, I'm starting part one of a two-part segment on Simon Peter. So let's get that underway. Simon Peter. Of all the apostles, besides Paul, Simon Peter is probably the one we know the most about. Jesus called Peter by the name Cephas, C-E-P-H-A-S, which means in Hebrew, stone. Now, many people down through the years have taken this to mean that Peter, is the rock of the church, the foundation upon which Jesus built the church. That is certainly the Catholic view of Peter. They view him, as I said, as the rock, the foundation of the church. However, we Protestants don't see it that way. We think that's simply not true. Jesus promised to build his church upon himself, not upon Peter. Even Peter was careful to tell us this very thing in 1 Peter chapter 2. If the Apostle Paul had ever thought that Peter was the foundation of the church, which was organized in Jerusalem, he certainly would have never said that there is no other foundation for the church but Christ himself. So I wanted to get that out of the way at the beginning. Even though Jesus calls Peter Cephas, which means stone, even though Jesus calls him the rock, gives him the nickname the rock, that does not mean that Peter was the foundation of the Christian church. Jesus himself was the foundation. And even Peter admits that. Peter, as said in the beginning, he was the most well-known probably of all the apostles other than Paul. So let's get a few facts about Peter. Peter was from the city of Capernaum. Now, Capernaum was a fishing village in Galilee. Peter, as we all know, was a fisherman by trade. It was at Peter's house that we hear about Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law, because Peter's mother-in-law lived with him and his wife, and she was sick when they came by, the disciples and Jesus, so Jesus healed her of her sickness. It seems as if Jesus used Peter's house as a center for the headquarters of his ministry. Now, Peter was actually brought to Christ by his brother Andrew. They were both fishermen plying their trade on the Sea of Galilee. After Peter met Jesus and accepted Jesus as Lord and Messiah, he did a kind of strange thing. He goes back to fishing. But a little later, Jesus comes by where he's fishing in Capernaum, and he's working on his nets out in the boat a little ways out from the dock. Andrew's there with him, and they get the nets ready to go out the next morning. And Jesus calls out to them. And he says to them, both Peter and Andrew, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Now, this is quoted in Matthew chapter 4, verse 19. Well, Peter and Andrew immediately left their nets, left their boats, and followed Jesus. Now, this was a hard thing for Peter to do because he was married. He had his wife to look after. We know his mother-in-law lived with him also. We don't know if Peter had any children or not. It's not mentioned, but he may have. But he's given up his job and leaving his family. He must have felt strongly the call to follow Jesus. Now, Peter was an interesting man. He was not a very modest person. He was usually very self-assertive when he spoke. In other words, Peter said exactly what he thought. He didn't pull any punches. I grew up with a lady like that named Miss Hallie Gupton. She didn't pull any punches. She told you exactly what she thought. In the early days, after Jesus ascended into heaven, Peter was frequently the spokesman for the 12 apostles. Only Paul, in the list of Jesus' apostles, would outshine Peter. However, the early Christians actually regarded Paul as the greatest of all the apostles, regarded Peter as the greatest of all the apostles, even greater than Paul. Now, Peter was kind of an impulsive man. He often acted first and thought second. Because of that, he would from time to time put his foot in his mouth. However, Peter's character as a loyal follower of Jesus Christ was not as firm as it should have been. For example, the night before Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane by the temple guards, the night before at the Lord's Supper, Peter loudly proclaimed his loyalty to Christ, that he would die in the service of his master. But later on that night, early in the morning of the next day, when Jesus was actually arrested, Peter, like the rest of the disciples, ran away. As we look closer at Peter, we see that he is a rare combination of courage on one hand and cowardice on the other. Of great strength in one way, but great insecurity in another. If you read the Gospels carefully, you will notice that Jesus spoke directly to Peter more than he did to any other disciple. And sometimes he was praising Peter, and sometimes he was blaming him for something he'd done or said wrong. However, again, a close reading of the Gospel shows us that under the guidance of Jesus Christ, a little bit at the time, Peter's volatile character was brought under control. Until finally, after the Holy Spirit came to the disciples, the day we call Pentecost, Peter became the leader of the apostles. He became the leader of the early Christian church. He became a great example of what faith in Jesus Christ is supposed to look like. Now, the book of Acts reveals a great deal about Peter. In fact, we could break Acts into two parts. The first half of Acts is composed mostly of stories about Simon Peter. And the second half of Acts is composed mostly of stories about the Apostle Paul. Acts tells us, for example, now I want you to count the things I'm going to go through that Acts tells us about Peter. I wrote down 9, and there are probably some I missed. First, Acts tells us, for example, that it was Peter who urged the other disciples to choose a 12th disciple to replace Judas. And as we remember, they chose a man named Matthias. So that's number 1. Secondly, it was Peter who preached to the multitude on the day of Pentecost. He gave the actual first sermon of the Christian church. Y'all have to excuse me, I just got through eating. Third, it was Peter who healed the lame man, the crippled man, the first miracle of the Christian church. In Galatians chapter 2, verse 9, written by Paul, Paul speaks of Peter and John as pillars of the church. Number 4, it was Peter who defended the cause of the gospel when the Jewish religious authorities took action against the apostles and tried to shut them up. It was Peter who stepped forward and defended the gospel. 5, it was Peter who exercised church discipline in the early Christian church, and I know you remember this, in the cases of Ananias and Sapphira, when they gave a certain amount of money to the church because they had sold some land, said they had given all their money when actually they hadn't. And Peter told them, you didn't just lie to me, you lied to God. And we all know what happened there. They both fell dead. That is really some church discipline. I would not advise that today, of course. Number 6, it was Peter who spoke out against Simon the magician, who sought to buy the gift of the Holy Spirit. The common people in Peter's day felt that if they could just get in his shadow, that they would be healed of their sicknesses and their infirmities. That's how high and close to Jesus they felt Peter was. That if they could just get in his shadow, that Jesus was with him so much that they'd be healed. Number 7, Peter was designated by the 12 apostles in Jerusalem to go to Samaria to look into a reported spiritual renewal of new Christians joining the church, going on in Samaria under the direction of Philip. Peter, along with John, was sent to make sure that it was genuine. In other words, to make sure that these people had really received the Holy Spirit. Now, that's a Bible study for another day because they had not. But we won't get into that tonight. Number 8, following this, Peter appeared in missionary activities in Lydda, Joppa, and Caesarea. And it was in Caesarea where he is specifically mentioned as having been led to baptize Cornelius, the Roman centurion, and his entire family and household, including the servants. Number 9, Peter was also noted to have appeared at what was known as the Apostolic Council. And the Apostolic Council is where the Jews met to decide in their mind, God already decided it, but to decide in their mind whether or not the Gentiles could be included in the Christian movement. And Peter spoke forward and defended the inclusion of the Gentiles. Peter told his fellow Jews that Jesus came to save the whole world, not just the Jews. Of course, he and Paul were in great agreement on that. After the Apostolic Council is talked about in the book of Acts, from that point on, Peter disappears. He's not mentioned again in the book of Acts, and it's from that point on that we hear about Paul and his missionary journeys. Now, Paul did mention Peter in his epistles, in several of his books. But one of the places he mentioned him was to point out Peter's mistake. And Peter admitted this mistake in not standing up to the Jewish Christians from Jerusalem who wanted to make the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians separate. They didn't want them to worship together. And Peter at first supported that, and Paul called him on it. And Peter admitted he was wrong. Let's learn a lesson from that. It takes a much bigger man or woman to admit they're wrong when they are wrong. So what happened to Peter after the book of Acts? Well, it's thought fairly certain that Peter went to Corinth, where Paul had founded a church. One way we know that is we're going back now to a church writer, a church historian. Remember, we talked about them in the first lesson. In the epistles of Ignatius. Now, Ignatius was an early Christian historian, and he became later on the bishop of Antioch, what we call the pastor. In the epistles of Ignatius, there's a reference to Peter being at the church of Antioch. So in Corinth and Antioch, we know he went and preached the gospel at both these places. There's also widespread belief that Peter actually decided to set up his headquarters, the place he would come back to and live when he was not out on the road preaching, in Antioch. The reason we really believe this to be true is that 1 Peter dedicated that book. Peter dedicated 1 Peter to the people who lived in the area of Antioch. Now, many of these people were what historians call from the lost tribes of Israel. Now, I'm not going to go into explanation right tonight who the lost tribes of Israel were. Just suffice it to say they were not living in Galilee and Judea. They were living outside of there. And I'm sure in a lesson later on I'll go into detail of why they were called the lost tribes of Israel. But 1 Peter is dedicated to those Jewish people. Therefore, 6 cities as Antioch, Corinth, Ephesus, Alexandria, and other smaller cities, smaller than Jerusalem, became strong centers of Christian churches. You see, Christianity began in the large cities like Jerusalem, and then it spread out into the interior of Judea and Galilee to the smaller cities like these 4 I just mentioned. In fact, it is said by several church historians that Peter actually was the one who started the Christian church in Antioch. Some more information about Peter. I know this is a lot of facts, but you can listen to this more than once if you need to remember all the facts. Peter, it is believed, was actually the bishop of Antioch for 7 years, the pastor. We believe this time period to be from about 33 AD to 40 AD, not long after Jesus was crucified and rose and ascended. In 40 AD, he left Antioch, and he appointed a man named Euodius, Eoudis. He appointed Euodius as his successor as bishop before leaving and heading west to preach the gospel. It is likely then that Peter was in the city of Babylon around 44 AD, and this is about the time that he wrote 1 Peter. So probably he was in Babylon preaching and writing 1 Peter around 44 AD. Now, he didn't finish it at that time, of course. Took a while to finish it, but that's when he began. Notice or remember I said that Peter, when he followed Jesus and went into evangelism, left his wife and his mother-in-law in Capernaum. But we know that at least one time he went back and got his wife and took her with him when he went to preach in Corinth. Now, probably after he was through in Corinth, he may have taken his wife back home. We don't know for sure. But there's a lot of evidence that he did go and get her and take her with him on at least one of his evangelic preaching missions. Now, Peter was preaching in Corinth, in Antioch, and these other places because he left Jerusalem. The reason he left Jerusalem, he had been arrested twice and put in prison in Jerusalem. You can read about that in the book of Acts while preaching the gospel. So he decided it's best for him to leave Jerusalem and go to other parts of the world. That's how he ended up in Antioch. That's how he ended up in Corinth and all these other places that he did go. We don't know everywhere he went. We just know 4 or 5. But he spent that time evangelizing, preaching the gospel, healing people through Jesus Christ. Peter couldn't heal anybody by himself. But through the power of Jesus Christ, healing people and leading people to Jesus. Now, the reason Peter did this, I just said, was he'd already been put in jail twice. But there was something else that led to this. The 12 apostles, who are all still in Jerusalem, trying to convert the Jews in Jerusalem to the gospel. And they converted a lot of them, but they were having a lot of trouble with the religious authorities in Jerusalem, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So it was decided in a meeting by the 12 apostles that they'd split up and go their different ways outside of Jerusalem. It was decided, for example, that Paul and his followers would go and preach to the Gentiles. So this is when Paul goes out of Jerusalem and starts on his missionary journeys a little later. He had to prepare, of course. He had to work a while and build up some money. And Paul was a tent maker, if you remember. And he had to get his, everything in his mind ready. If he had to write anything down, he had to do that. So it wasn't immediate, but it was after Paul left Jerusalem that he started preparing to go on his missionary journeys. Peter and the people who followed him were to give witness also outside of Jerusalem, but to the Jews that lived outside of Jerusalem. So Paul was instructed, go preach to the Gentiles, preach the gospel to the Gentiles. Peter was instructed, go preach the gospel to our fellow Jews. But let's get out of Jerusalem. Too much heat on for us right now in Jerusalem. Let's get out of here. And the other disciples, of course, went different places also. We'll discuss them later when we get to them one by one. Therefore, because of this decision to leave Jerusalem, Peter was recognized from the beginning with the Jewish party within Christianity. And Paul was identified with the Gentile party within Christianity. However, there are many occasions when both men at times dealt with people in the other group. Peter witnessed to the Gentiles. Paul witnessed to the Jews. But primarily and mostly, Peter witnessed to the Jews, Paul to the Gentiles. So, now that I have just filled your head with all these facts and information, I hope you know a little bit more about what happened to Peter as far as his preaching was concerned. Of course, we haven't got through with that yet, because next week we're going to begin with this question. Did Peter evangelize the area north of Rome? Now, what area are they talking about here? They're talking about what is today Great Britain, England, Scotland, Ireland. They're talking about an area in those days called Gaul, G-A-U-L. And Gaul was the present-day countries of France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Switzerland. So did Peter go north of Rome and preach in these areas? Well, we'll talk about that next week in part 2 of Simon Peter. And we'll also discuss what probably happened to him. We all know that Peter died a martyr's death. And we'll discuss actually what we think, what we know, and what we, as a friend of mine used to say, think we know, happened to Peter at the end of his life. Well, I hope you have a good week. Hope to see you at 9:30 Sunday morning under the trees at Riley Road Baptist Church. Good night and God bless.